One summer afternoon, a French farmer stood at his kitchen door, watching in fear as his dog ran in manic circles around his barnyard. The normally gentle animal had gone insane. Every time the farmer tried to grab him by the collar, the dog snapped at him and then went back to running in its crazy circles. But suddenly, the dog stopped running. He sniffed at the ground, then bit down on a rock and chewed on it so hard his mouth started to bleed. Nothing the farmer did could get him to stop. The dog just kept chewing on more and more rocks until blood was running down his mouth and his teeth were starting to fall out. What the farmer couldn't know as he watched his beloved dog go crazy was that only 2 days later, he, the farmer, would be the one running around that same yard, screaming incoherently like a madman. It was an inexplicable horror that would spread throughout the entire village, and no one would know how to stop it. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you liked today's story, please sign the follow button up for karaoke in the Philippines and put them down for the song My Way by Frank Sinatra. This week's story is called Tigers on the Ceiling. On a hot Friday afternoon in August of 1951, Dr. Albert Gabay drove his car through the narrow streets of a village in the south of France. He had just spent a relaxing week with his family in the Pyrenees, which is a mountain range that runs along the border between France and Spain. His wife and 4 kids were still at their mountain cabin, enjoying their vacation, but Dr. Gabay had to reopen his office and return to work. Now, after a long drive, he was finally back in his hometown of Pont-Saint-Esprit. His route took him along a street that had been heavily bombed during World War II. He drove past gray stone buildings that stood next to piles of stone rubble. In the distance, he could see the Rhone River sparkling in the afternoon sun. He turned a corner and spotted his friend, the grocer, who stood in the doorway of his store greeting customers. Dr. Gabay waved hello through his car window and continued on his way. Further into town, he slowed to a stop so that the baker could carry sacks of flour across the street. Dr. Gabay loved this town, where he had lived his entire life. Pont-Saint-Esprit was small enough that there were only 2 other doctors besides him who worked there. It was a friendly place where everyone seemed to know each other. Not long ago, Dr. Gabay had wondered if he'd be forced to leave Pont-Saint-Esprit. During World War II, the village was occupied by the German army. Then Allied forces sent in warplanes to bomb the German troops. It was a terrifying ordeal, and the recovery had been slow, but the doctor was optimistic that the village would one day be fully restored to its former glory. The sun was low in the sky when Dr. Gabay turned into a small courtyard and parked his car. His home and medical office shared a stone building in the center of the village. As he carried his suitcase towards the front door, Dr. Gabay was looking forward to eating a simple dinner and getting to bed early. But when he opened the door, his housekeeper, who had arrived earlier to tidy up, rushed to greet him with a concerned look on her face. Before she could say anything, Dr. Gabay stopped in surprise. The waiting room of his first-floor office was jammed full of people. The small room had a dozen wood chairs pushed up against the walls, and every seat was filled. Old men leaned their heads back against the wall with their eyes closed. Some mothers held children in their laps, and other children were sprawled on the floor. Dr. Gabay recognized one entire family. Everyone looked clammy and pale. He took a breath and frowned. The room had a sharp and unpleasant odor. His housekeeper explained that over the last few hours, sick people kept showing up asking to see him. She told them that she wasn't sure what time he would return, but they decided to wait for him anyway. There was clearly something going around in the village, and Dr. Gabay wanted to be sure he wasn't dealing with a serious outbreak. Dinner would have to wait. Dr. Gabay headed for the exam room and told his housekeeper to send in the first patient. Over the next several hours, Dr. Gabay examined them one by one. Their complaints were identical: upset stomach, nausea, and chills. And so it seemed very likely that they all had mild cases of food poisoning. Dr. Gabai thought it was odd that so many people got hit with it at once, but he was sure there was a reasonable explanation for that. There had been a lot of problems with the food supply as France struggled to recover from the war, so it wasn't unusual for people to come down with food poisoning every once in a while. The treatment for it was simple. Most people just needed a few days' rest to make a full recovery. Dr. Gabai gave the patients some medicine to settle their stomachs and assured them that they would feel better soon. It would take several hours to get to every single patient, but when the last one had left his office, Dr. Gabai slowly made his way up the stairs to finally eat his dinner. He called his wife to explain what was going on, and after he was done reassuring her, he climbed right into bed and fell asleep. At 11 o'clock the next morning, Dr. Gabai was standing in the kitchen of a farmhouse with the family who lived there. Half of the family had been sick in his waiting room the evening before. Dr. Gabai didn't usually work on Saturdays, but he thought it would be good to check in on some of the patients he had seen. This was his second house call of the morning. He had looked over the family members one by one, and he was now examining a skinny boy dressed in a nightshirt. The boy said he felt better today, and Dr. Gabai smiled. He was glad that most of his patients seemed to be doing better. But something didn't feel quite right to Dr. Gabai. Even before he stopped in to see this boy and his family, he had started to wonder if something other than food poisoning was troubling the residents of Pont-Saint-Esprit. For one thing, he had questioned all of the patients, but he still hadn't figured out what they had all eaten that could have made them all sick. But there was another thing Dr. Gabai noticed that was even stranger. The farmhouse's kitchen had an incredibly unpleasant odor. It was the same one that had filled his waiting room the day before. It took a while before the doctor could put his finger on where he had smelled it before. It was years ago, in his own house. Some mice had been living inside his bedroom wall, but then the mice died, and it took several days for the smell of decay to go away. That dead mouse odor, like a mixture of rotten cabbage and sulfur, was what he was smelling when he was around some of his patients. This farmhouse, like all of the houses he visited that morning, was clean. Its windows were open, and the smell of warm bread from the nearby bakery was coming in with the summer breeze. There was no evidence of mice anywhere. But for the moment, Dr. Gabai didn't have time to think about it too much. Just before noon, after finishing his house calls, the weary doctor returned to his office, and his waiting room was full again. All the patients were again showing signs of food poisoning, and all had that same horrible smell. Whatever had happened was clearly not an isolated event. Dr. Gabai had to get to the bottom of it before things got out of hand. At 11 o'clock that night, Dr. Gabai was still in his office doing paperwork when there was a knock on his door. He opened it to find one of the other doctors in the village standing there. His name was Dr. Vieux, and he looked completely exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. Dr. Vieux told him that he had also seen a lot of patients with symptoms of food poisoning while Dr. Gabai was away on vacation, and that the number of patients had begun to rise the day before Dr. Gabai came back to town. Dr. Gabai sighed and rubbed his temples. Unfortunately, the third doctor in the village was sick with the illness going around town and couldn't get out of bed. And so it was up to Dr. Vieux and Dr. Gabai to handle whatever was happening. The two doctors could only handle so much. If more people got sick, they might not be able to take care of them all. The two doctors started to compare notes. Dr. Vieux had also noticed that a lot of his patients were emitting the same awful odor of dead mice that Dr. Gabai had smelled, and Dr. Vieux was just as mystified. On top of that, over the course of the day, both doctors had noted that some of their patients had symptoms that were so bizarre they didn't know how to start treating them. Their skin was growing pale, their pupils were dilated, and they struggled to keep their minds focused. It was so bad that several of them said they were no longer able to read. Whatever this disease was, it wasn't normal food poisoning. As the doctors wrapped up their meeting, they realized that between them, they had seen at least 230 patients in the last few days. In a town with a population of just 4,000, that was a huge number. They agreed that it was time to notify the authorities, since the situation could stretch the town's resources. Before leaving, Dr. Vieux stopped in the doorway and made a confession. He wasn't feeling well himself, and wondered if he was coming down with the same illness as everyone else. As Dr. Gabai closed the door, he tried to stay calm and keep focused on the facts. He was relieved that he didn't feel sick, he just felt tired. But a medical crisis was clearly emerging in Pont-Saint-Esprit, and now it looked like Dr. Gabai might be the only doctor healthy enough to handle it. With those heavy thoughts weighing on him, at 2 a.m, Dr. Gabai sat back down at his desk to catch up on his notes. Not long after, the phone rang. It was the wife of a local farmer named Felix Meissen. Dr. Gabai had made a visit to their home earlier on Saturday when he was making house calls. Felix's condition seemed to be improving, but now he could hear panic in the voice of Felix's wife. She said that Felix could hardly breathe or talk, and that he was acting like a madman. Within minutes, Dr. Gabai was in his car, speeding through dark country roads towards the farmhouse. Felix's wife met him at the door. She said that shortly after Dr. Gabai left their house on Saturday, Felix suddenly jumped up out of bed and ran out into the yard. Then he burst back in and rolled back and forth on his bed, screaming at the top of his lungs. Now, 12 hours later, he was curled up in a ball on the mattress, struggling to breathe. Dr. Gabai went immediately to the bedside to examine him. Felix was lying motionless, his breathing loud and ragged. He seemed barely conscious and didn't respond when Dr. Gabai spoke to him. His pupils were dilated and his temperature was low. Dr. Gabai worried that Felix's heart was going to give out if he didn't get treatment as soon as possible. The closest hospital that could handle this kind of emergency was an hour's drive south in a city called Nîmes. Dr. Gabai called for an ambulance and then tended to Felix while they waited for it to arrive. The doctor was grasping for any clue he could find, so he asked Felix's wife what they had eaten in the past few days. Just what they always ate, she said, summer stew, bread, cheese, and wine. But then she recalled that something terrible had happened at their house 2 days ago. They found their dog running in circles outside. Before they knew it, the dog was chewing on rocks until blood began pouring out of its mouth. Minutes later, their beloved pet went into convulsions and died. Dr. Gabai thought it was very possible that the dog's death was connected to the same illness that Felix and the others were all suffering from. If that was the case, the situation was even more serious than he thought. If the dog died, then people could die as well. The leaders of Pont-Saint-Esprit needed to be alerted to the danger as soon as possible. That evening, Dr. Gabai sat in a crowded and stuffy room in the town hall where a heated discussion was underway. It was Sunday now, and earlier that day, he had convinced the mayor to call an emergency meeting about this strange medical crisis with the municipal council, the police chief, and other city officials. But so far, everyone was just arguing. Dr. Gabai was frustrated. There were now at least 280 people affected with this bizarre and now potentially lethal illness, and he was at his limit. Dr. Gabai had been working almost non-stop with very little sleep since he returned from his vacation over 48 hours ago. His eyes burned with fatigue and his temper rose, so he stood up and made sure his voice was strong, and he told everyone they needed to alert the town to the danger. The mayor placed a hand on his shoulder. He was just as concerned as Dr. Gabai, but scientists and medical experts from nearby universities had been summoned to study the problem, and the remains of Felix Meissen's dog would be sent to the lab to be analyzed. The mayor felt the best course was to gather that data and then figure out what to tell the townspeople. Anything else would make everyone more panicked. Dr. Gabai grew even more impatient. He insisted that their analysis would take too much time. The danger was already here, and people needed to be warned now so they could protect themselves. But the mayor held his ground. What would they warn people about exactly? They still didn't even know what was causing the trouble. At this point, the mayor thought the so-called crisis consisted of a dead dog and multiple people with a stomach flu, and there was no proof that the two were even related. But there was one precaution that the mayor did want to take right away. Before adjourning the meeting, the mayor turned to the police chief. Given the number of people afflicted with the illness, they couldn't rule out the possibility that someone was deliberately poisoning the village. The police chief agreed to launch a criminal investigation right away, but he would need assistance from law enforcement officials in neighboring cities. The meeting ended at 1 a.m., and Dr. Gabai started walking home, exhausted and frustrated. A criminal investigation seemed like a total waste of time to him. After all, why would anyone be launching such a vicious attack on their tiny and somewhat insignificant town? But then, the more he thought about it, the doctor supposed that a criminal motive could not really be ruled out. All he knew was that he needed to get home and sleep if he was going to be of any help to his patients the next day. But just as he entered the courtyard in front of his home, he heard high-pitched shrieks coming from the nearby grocery store. Dr. Gabai ran down the street to the store and pounded on the door. The grocer's wife was relieved to see him and brought him up the stairs to the family's apartment and into her daughter's room. There, on her bed, 5-year-old Marie Joseph Carl was writhing in agony. Her arms and legs were jerking, her fingers and toes clenched so tightly that they were white and bloodless. The doctor hurried to the child's side and tried to pry her toes open. In their rigid position, it was impossible for blood to flow properly, and her feet could be permanently damaged. Suddenly, Marie Joseph sat upright, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed at the air in front of her and screamed that tigers were coming to eat her. Dr. Gabai enlisted the mother's help to restrain the child, and then he gave Marie Joseph a shot of a sedative that he hoped would calm her down. The doctor rubbed his eyes and told the weeping mother that Marie Joseph had to be treated in a hospital and that he needed to call an ambulance. Dr. Gabai then walked down the hallway towards the kitchen where the phone was located, but as he stepped past the parents' bedroom, he stopped. There, inside the room, was the grocer, Mr. Carl, sitting up on his elbows in bed as he stared out the window. The doctor was confused as to why Mr. Carl wasn't tending to his daughter. The grocer seemed strangely preoccupied and disturbed. When Dr. Gabai stepped closer to him, he realized the grocer wasn't staring out the window, he was just staring at it. As if in a trance, Mr. Carl held up his finger and softly counted the 6 panes embedded in the window. He repeated the numbers over and over and over again. Dr. Gabai sniffed the air and detected that familiar smell of dead mice. It could only mean one thing, that Mr. Carl had fallen ill as well. After making sure Mr. Carl was comfortable, Dr. Gabai returned to Marie Joseph's bedroom. He expected her to be groggy from the sedative, maybe even asleep. Instead, he found the child alert and happy, as if she had been fully cured. The child looked at the doctor and smiled and told him that the tigers must have been a dream. The doctor checked her temperature and her pulse. She was totally back to normal. Instead of putting Marie Joseph to sleep, the sedative appeared to have completely cured her. Dr. Gabai shook his head. None of this made any sense. He decided to hold off calling the ambulance, thinking Marie Joseph could now fully recover at home. It was nearly dawn when Dr. Gabai said goodnight to the Carl family and staggered back to his house. As he opened his door, the phone was ringing. It was the hospital in Nîmes. Felix Meissen, the farmer, was dead. Whatever illness was attacking the town of Pont-Saint-Esprit, it was fatal. This had officially turned into a full-blown medical catastrophe. Later that morning, a wave of law enforcement officers swept into Pont-Saint-Esprit. They stopped people on the street to ask questions, they interrogated shopkeepers, and closed some shops entirely. The presence of so many police officers alarmed people, and gossip began to fly around the village. Every person knew someone who was sick. Some people speculated that perhaps the rumors were true, and a madman or killer was poisoning the village. Maybe he poisoned the water, or perhaps the salt or the meat or some other food. Some people quietly packed and left town. By the end of the day, the once bustling center of the village was growing empty and quiet. Dr. Gabai watched families leaving from the door of his house. He thought of his own wife and kids who were still on vacation in the mountains. He'd spoken to them briefly at the start of this sickness, but he wanted to check in on them again. So he placed a phone call to the vacation house. His wife was shocked when he updated her about the terrifying events unfolding in their town. She worried that her husband would wear himself out or get the awful illness himself. Dr. Gabai told his wife that he was fine, and he believed that she and their kids were safe since they were out of town. However, he had a duty to continue to treat the people of his village. Dr. Gabai hung up the phone. The next day was Tuesday, 4 days since he had come home from vacation. By mid-morning, the delegation of university doctors and scientists had arrived. They collected food scraps and sent them out to be analyzed by a scientific laboratory to test for poison. And then they ordered an autopsy to be performed on Felix Meissen. Dr. Gabay tried to reassure his patients that they'd have answers soon. But in private, he worried about how long it was taking. It would be several days at least before the test results came back and the autopsy was complete. He couldn't stand the thought of more people dying as they waited. Not only that, but Dr. Gabay didn't know how long he could continue to work without rest, and there was still the possibility that he would get sick himself. As the weeks wore on with still no news about the tests or the autopsy, Dr. Gabay saw dozens of patients in his office and crisscrossed the streets to visit the sicker patients at home. His phone rang every night with news of more strange symptoms emerging. Now, many of his patients seemed irrationally happy. They talked so quickly that it was impossible to understand them. But then, just as fast as the euphoria emerged, it would come crashing down, leaving the patients overcome with anguish. And then there were the patients who just couldn't sleep. Instead, they would gather in the street in the middle of the night. Dr. Gabay could hear them from his window, chatting and laughing with a strange, frenetic energy. Others he could see wandering aimlessly through the dark streets, silent and lost. It was as if Pont-Saint-Esprit had become haunted and cursed. The village priest prayed to saints to lift the curse from the town. Dr. Gabay wasn't superstitious, but it made him remember a disease he had read about many years before. It was called St. Anthony's Fire, a sickness that happened back in the Middle Ages and caused entire villages to go mad, just like he was seeing in Pont-Saint-Esprit. Back then, many people believed that it was a curse from the devil. Dr. Gabay was a man of science, but he wondered if there could be a connection. At this point, a supernatural explanation from the 15th century was as good as any other. Dr. Gabay shook his head. This was modern France, and medicine didn't operate on hunches. The most pressing thing right now was for the toxicology lab to finish its work. In the meantime, he would continue to treat his patients as well as he could, and he would look up old diseases once he had some free time. He hoped this would be soon. Once the lab had an answer, he would know how to treat the disease, everyone would get better, and he would have enough time to pursue his hunches. Instead, he'd find out things could still get much, much worse. It was Friday evening, just 1 week since Dr. Gabay had returned from his vacation. He was in his car following an ambulance that carried little Marie Joseph Karl. Her delirious visions of tigers had returned, and she had become so violent that her mother had to tie her to the bed. Dr. Gabay had watched helplessly as the 5-year-old was loaded into an ambulance, kicking and screaming. As he parked his car in front of the old hospital in Pont-Saint-Esprit, he noticed that every light in the building was blazing. As he walked to the entrance, Dr. Gabay saw a man appear in a second-floor window, waving his arms wildly. And then, to Dr. Gabay's horror, the man climbed out the window and stood on the ledge. 2 nurses quickly crept up behind him, begging him to get back in the room, but every time they reached out, the man smacked their hands away. Then the man stretched out his arms and proclaimed that he was an airplane and that he could fly, and then he jumped. He landed with his feet on the pavement, and immediately there was this deafening crack as both of his legs snapped in half. The man screamed in agony as he lay on his back. But suddenly, the man's energy shifted. It was as if he pushed the pain right out of his body and replaced it with intense anger. Somehow, the man with the 2 broken legs rose up and then took off running full speed down the boulevard. Dr. Gabay couldn't believe what he was seeing. How could anyone run on 2 totally broken legs? And this was only the beginning of the night that seemed to Dr. Gabay like an apocalypse. He entered the hospital to find the wards packed full of screaming, struggling patients. His patients, who had seemed to be getting better, were now totally psychotic. Many screamed that their hands and feet were on fire. Some fought desperately against imaginary enemies in the air. The odor of dead mice was now overwhelming. Dr. Gabay was on the brink of collapse. He started to wonder if he himself had gotten sick. Was he hallucinating or going crazy? Dr. Gabay considered whether he should just give up and finally get the sleep he so desperately needed. But ultimately, he knew that quitting was a violation of his oath as a doctor, and the residents of Pont-Saint-Esprit were counting on him, so he chose to soldier on. He put out an order that Marie-Joseph be sent to another hospital 30 miles away in Avignon, where he hoped it would be calmer. Then he tried injecting some of the victims with sedatives, hoping to quiet them since it had worked before with Marie-Joseph. But the sedatives had absolutely no effect on their ferocious behavior. The strength and violence of the patients was beyond belief. They were dangerous to themselves and to everyone around them. One patient sprung up from his bed, punching and kicking at everyone around him. It took 14 men to hold him down. While that was happening, several other patients broke away from their rooms and tried to jump out windows or run through walls. Dr. Gabay saw no option but to immobilize patients in straitjackets and send them to be locked up in a psychiatric hospital. But then the hospital ran out of straitjackets. Nurses tied patients to their beds with ropes and twine, where they lay screaming in horror. When they ran out of rope, the nurses used horses' reins. But the restraints didn't hold. One by one, victims broke away and ran back out into the hospital garden, where they uprooted tomato stakes and wielded them like swords against each other. Dr. Gabay worked through the night trying to treat the injuries that patients had inflicted on themselves. One of these patients was the man who had leapt out of the window and broken both of his legs. It took 8 men to hold him down as Dr. Gabay set his fractures. As he worked, Dr. Gabay noticed that the man's toes were rigid and bluish-green. Over the course of this long and horrible night, it seemed like every patient he had seen had toes and fingers that were stiff and lifeless. Dr. Gabay paused as the screaming and mayhem continued all around him. He thought of Marie-Joseph's rigid hands and feet. He thought of the terrible smell that reminded him of dead mice. He thought again of the Middle Ages and the curse of St. Anthony's fire. And then a picture started to come into focus in his mind. He would need the lab results to prove it, but he believed he had just figured out what was causing this horrific sickness, and it tied all the way back to the medieval plague of St. Anthony's fire. It took several days for Dr. Gabay and the medical investigators to fully uncover the truth, but they discovered that it had all started in an unassuming shop in the center of Pont-Saint-Esprit. At noon on Thursday, August 16th, the day before Dr. Gabay returned from vacation, the village baker, Roche-Brion, completed the third and last batch of bread of the day. Roche had been a baker in Pont-Saint-Esprit for 30 years. Every household in the village bought at least one fresh loaf of bread every day, and many thought that Roche's bread was the best in town. However, on that day, August 16th, Roche was not pleased with the quality of his product. As he kneaded the dough, he noticed that the color was slightly gray. There had been complaints about the bread recently. He blamed the flour, which had been delivered to him by the government agency that supplied flour to bakeries all over France. Ever since the war, the flour had been of bad quality. It was usually wheat flour mixed with flour made from rye grain and dried beans. Sometimes it even contained dust and insects. That day he was making the bread, the baker knew that the dough just seemed a little off. Still, every time he tasted it, he thought it tasted fine. So he baked the bread, put it out for sale, and decided he'd lodge a protest with the flour suppliers the next morning. All day Thursday, people streamed into his shop for their bread, and again all day Friday and Saturday. Before dawn on Sunday, Roche and his wife were feeling a little nauseous, but they decided to take an overnight trip to see their kids who were spending the summer out of town. When Roche and his wife returned to Pont-Saint-Esprit on Monday, the epidemic was in full swing, his bakery had been closed by the police, and Roche's wife was now so ill that she went straight to bed. When the police concluded their investigations, they confirmed that everyone who got sick had bought bread from Roche's bakery. What Roche didn't know was that a portion of the rye grain that was used by the government to dilute the flour was bad. It had gotten damp in the field and a fungus had grown on it. That fungus had been ground up with the rest of the grain as it was turned into flour, and this flour ended up in a sack that was delivered to Roche's bakery to use for making his bread. This fungus was incredibly resilient. It not only survived being ground into flour, It also survived the high heat of Roche's bakery oven. It lay dormant in the crusty brown loaves Roche sold to his customers, and then when Roche's customers ate their bread, this fungus entered their bodies. The fungus caused their stomachs to cramp, made it impossible to sleep, and caused people to feel like their hands and feet were burning. It also triggered hallucinations of tigers and airplanes and flying. It even made dogs turn on their owners and think that rocks were food. In fact, it had affected all sorts of animals, including pigs, ducks, and cats. All of these bizarre responses were triggered by chemicals in the fungus. One of these chemicals was lysergic acid, from which lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, is made. LSD is a very powerful hallucinogen. On top of all of this, when people ate the fungus, it set off a response in their bodies that cut off circulation to their limbs. The terrible stink that reminded Dr. Gabai of dead mice was actually the smell of his patient's fingers and toes slowly rotting with gangrene. This gangrene was well known in the Middle Ages when it was a symptom of the plague known as St. Anthony's Fire. Now, hundreds of years later, in 1951, this same plague was running rampant through the village of Pont-Saint-Esprit long after the disease had passed out of memory. The fungus was known as ergot, and the illness it caused was known to modern medicine as ergotism. Ultimately, 7 people died and nearly 300 people were sickened in the ergotism outbreak in Pont-Saint-Esprit. It took several months for the disease to run its course. Most patients slowly got better and were able to resume their normal lives. The baker, Roche, was at first suspected of intentionally poisoning the village, but was later found to be blameless. The memory of the 1951 poisoning still haunts the village. The official investigations went on for years. Finally, it was agreed that the people of Pont-Saint-Esprit had indeed been under the influence of some kind of hallucinatory substance contained in the flour. How the substance got into the flour remains under debate to this day. Was written by Heather Dundas and edited by Alex Benedon. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Natalie Bettendorf. Fact-checking was done by Jacqueline Coletti. For Ballen Studios, our producer is Alyssa Tomaneng. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our head of sound is Marcelino Villalpando. Our producer is Julie Magruder. Senior producers are Loredana Polivoda, Dave Schilling, and Matt Olmos. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louie for Wondery. February 2nd, 2012, a young man pulled off a 4-lane highway in Anchorage, Alaska, into a large, snowy parking lot. He passed by dozens of parked cars until he arrived in front of this small shack that was brightly teal-colored. It was a popular coffee shop called the Common Grounds, and this young man worked as a barista there. After he parked his car, he walked up to the white door employee entrance to this little building, and he got his key out and he went to unlock the door, but when he turned the key, he saw the door was already unlocked. He knew the girl who had worked the previous night and would have been responsible for locking the shop up. She was 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, and although she had only been on the job for about a month, she seemed very responsible and had never had any issues closing up before. The young man shrugged it off though. He figured people make mistakes, and he went inside. Right away, he noticed that a couple of things just seemed out of place. It was like Samantha must have just left in the middle of her shift without even attempting to clean up. There were napkins on the ground, there were towels out, there were cups still out. And so as this young man is walking over to the cash register to unlock it, he's running through scenarios in his head about how Samantha could have been so sloppy. And then he reached down with his register key, and just like the door, the cash register was already unlocked. When he pulled the tray out, all the money was gone. And that's when he knew they had been robbed. And so he called his boss. The night before, Samantha had asked her boyfriend, Dwayne, to pick her up after her shift at the common grounds. Dwayne arrived in front of the kiosk at about 8:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes after her shift should have been over. Dwayne had gotten held up at his job, which is why he was late. And so when he gets there, Dwayne looks around the parking lot and he doesn't see Samantha anywhere. He sees the coffee shop itself is totally dark and looks like it's been closed up for the night. And so Dwayne gets out of his truck into the freezing cold night air, and he walked up to the window of this coffee shop and he pressed his face up to the glass to look inside, but there was nobody in there. Dwayne automatically went back to the fight he had gotten into with Samantha earlier in the night via text message. She had accused him of cheating on her. He had been kind of nonchalant, like he didn't care about it, and what ensued was a really ugly fight. And so as Dwayne is walking back to his truck, he's thinking to himself, maybe Samantha just didn't want to see him because of the fight, and so at the end of her shift, she got a ride home from her father, or maybe from a friend, and that's why she's not here. And so Dwayne gets back inside of his truck, and he sends a text message to Samantha asking if she's okay, if she's gotten home, but after several minutes of no response from her, Dwayne, even though they were fighting, he still cares an awful lot about his girlfriend. He decides, I gotta go by her house and make sure she's there and that she's okay. And so a couple minutes later, he gets to her house, he goes up to the door, and her single father, James, answers the door. Dwayne explains that he didn't see Samantha after her shift and just wanted to make sure she was here, but James says, she's not here. I have no idea where she is. I haven't spoken to her. And so the two men go into James's kitchen, they sit down, and they start texting and calling Samantha to try to figure out where she is. And after a couple of minutes, Dwayne's phone lights up, and it's a text message from Samantha. And the message clearly indicates that she's still very upset with Dwayne, but she's saying that she needs some time to think and that she's going to be with some friends for a couple of days, and would he, Dwayne, let her father know where she was. And so Dwayne shows James the text message, and Samantha's father looks at it and he's thinking to himself, this is very uncharacteristic of Samantha. He had raised Samantha since she was 2 years old, and they were very close. They shared everything with each other. It didn't make any sense that she wouldn't contact him directly to say that she was going to be out with friends for a couple of days. And it didn't make sense that she would ignore all of his phone calls and text messages when clearly he was worried about her. The two men stayed up super late, calling and texting, hoping to get more information from Samantha, but she never responded. She never texted back. And so the following morning, when neither men had gotten any more messages from Samantha, James went to the Anchorage Police Department and filed a missing person report for his only daughter. After receiving this missing person report, an officer with the Anchorage Police Department called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. And the owner actually said they just got a call from their barista that was working at the kiosk that morning, and they had informed them that apparently there had been a robbery and no one can get in touch with Samantha. No one knows where she is. The owner told the police officer that as soon as she got her hands on the security footage from the night before, she would send it over to the police department. While the police waited for this footage, some officers began calling Samantha's friends and other family members to see if they knew where she was, but no one had heard from her and no one knew where she was. No one had any information. Some other police officers headed over to the Common Grounds coffee kiosk to get a look at it for themselves. And when they got there, there was no sign of a struggle outside or inside the kiosk, and inside, underneath the counter, was a panic button that had not been pressed. And so even though Samantha's father thought there was something odd about her final text message, the police began operating under the theory that Samantha had robbed the kiosk and then left of her own accord. But what confounded police was how Samantha actually physically got away from the coffee shop. She didn't have a car that night, and she couldn't have just walked away because the weather was way too miserable and cold outside, and Anchorage is just not really a walkable city. And so if Samantha was telling the truth, that she was just taking a couple of days to be by herself with some friends at their place, then why didn't any of her friends know where she was? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop made the security footage available. The footage, which has no audio, picks up around 8 p.m. on February 1st, 2012, which was the night Samantha went missing. It shows Samantha inside of the kiosk. She's working alone, she's cheerful, and she's busy, and then at some point, someone that we can't see, they're outside of the camera's range, comes up to the window and orders a drink. Samantha clearly turns to them, acknowledges acknowledges their drink order and turns and begins making this drink. And then after she's done making it, she turns to give it to this person, and immediately Samantha steps back and puts her arms up. And then seconds later, she reaches over and turns off the lights inside of the kiosk, and then she gets down on her knees with her back to the window. She stays in that position, not talking, not moving, for about a minute before she slowly stands up and walks down the kiosk towards the cash register. She opens it up, she scoops some money out of it, then she walks back to the window and appears to hand it to a shadowy figure on the other side of the window, and then Samantha turns, kneels again with her back to the window. 2 more minutes go by before this person outside the window leans their entire upper body inside of the coffee shop. They reach down and they appear to tie Samantha's hands. Now, because it was dark inside of the kiosk, the footage winds up being extremely grainy, and there's no way to identify who this figure is. Although it's fairly obvious that it's a male. He's wearing a big sweatshirt and he's got a hat pulled down low over his face. After this mystery man is done tying Samantha's hands, he leaps through the window and then shuts the window behind him. And then he stands Samantha up, he puts a gun into her back, then he marches her out the employee door and then out across the lot, all the way to a white pickup truck where he puts her inside and they drive off. Over the next couple of days, the police and also the FBI, who had been called in to be a part of this investigation, they just kept hitting dead end after dead end because there was no evidence. All they had was this surveillance footage that was too grainy to tell who this guy was that took Samantha. Meanwhile, Samantha's father, James, had rallied the support of nearly all 300,000 people that lived in Anchorage to go out and look for his daughter. His efforts were so profound, it had attracted major news outlets across the country, and suddenly his daughter's story had grabbed national headlines everywhere. This led to strangers donating thousands of dollars to fund a reward for anybody that had information about Samantha's whereabouts. But despite this reward growing in size every single day, and the national news media becoming increasingly more interested in this case, no one came forward with useful information that led to developments in this case, and Samantha never got in touch with Dwayne or her father. Then on February 24th, so 3 weeks after Samantha's gone missing and no one's heard from her, Dwayne got a text message from Samantha's phone, and it was directing him to a particular sign inside of a nearby public park. And so Dwayne and James read this text, they shared it with the police department, and then they raced to this park and actually beat the police there by about 15 minutes. And so Dwayne and James, they walk through the gates and they start walking down this main trail, and they stop in front of this sign. It was actually a bulletin board, and tacked on the bulletin board was a Ziploc bag inside of which was a typed ransom note, and on the ransom note, literally Xeroxed onto it, was a black and white photo of Samantha. And in this photo, Samantha looks kind of dazed, like she's got a blank expression, and she's not really looking at the camera, she's looking just to the side of the camera. And then in this picture, a man is holding a copy of the Anchorage Daily News newspaper that's dated February 13th, 2012. This was a proof of life photo where Samantha's captor was holding up that newspaper to indicate that Samantha was alive as of February 13th. And so to everybody involved in this case, including Samantha's father, even though this is still not a good situation at all, it was kind of a relief to know that at least as of last week, Samantha was alive. As for the demands of this ransom note, James was told to deposit $30,000 into his daughter's account immediately, and if he did that, she would be released 6 months later. As advised by the FBI, James deposited a portion of the ransom money into his daughter's account, and then the FBI just waited and watched, because they knew if anyone tried to withdraw money from that account, they could track where the card was. A few days later, 3 separate withdrawals were made within Anchorage, but each time the FBI got a notification about one of these withdrawals, they would rush to the scene, and whoever it was that had tried to make this withdrawal was long gone. When they pulled the security footage from these 3 different ATMs, the person that was making these withdrawals was a man wearing a ski mask and big sunglasses, so they had no way to identify him. After these withdrawals, the account went silent for over a week, and in that time, there was no word from Samantha. Then on March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but they were in Arizona, and then New Mexico, and then in Texas. Again, authorities would rush to these ATMs, but they would get there right after the masked man with sunglasses had just left. But there was a break this time. In one of these surveillance videos from one of the Texas ATMs, they spotted the car this guy was getting into before he left. And it was a small sedan, it was a white Ford Focus, and they saw him leave going east on a Texas highway. And so authorities in Texas were told to look out for this particular car in this part of Texas. And sure enough, on March 13th, a Texas patrolman spotted the car sitting in a hotel parking lot.
Food she was used to eating, but the doctor reassured her and said to go home and rest
and she would feel better soon. But that evening, Maria still felt just as sick. She called her mom, who lived in a neighboring town, and asked her to come stay for a few days. Maria's mother took a bus there right away, and once she got there, she did her best to nurse her daughter back to health, feeding her broth and herbs, but whatever Maria had caught, it just wasn't going away. Even worse, Maria's mother soon started to feel sick too, with the same symptoms of fever and upset stomach that Maria had. So 2 days later, Maria's mom had to return back to her home to rest and recuperate as well. Maria was confused. If she was suffering from a food allergy like the doctor thought, why would her mom have gotten sick too? So now she thought maybe she'd come down with the flu and her mother had just caught it from her. So when her brother-in-law, Ivo, stopped by the house on September 24th, Maria tried to keep her distance from him. She'd been sick for 4 days and didn't want to risk passing anything on. Ivo didn't stay long at Maria and Devaier's house, and soon he got back to his own home right in time for lunch. His wife had put out some egg sandwiches, and after Ivo and his wife had sat down to eat, they called in their daughter, Leiji, to come join them. But Leiji was having too much fun playing with her dolls, her glitter, and her coloring books. Finally, Leiji did abandon her toys and took her seat at the table with her parents. But just 10 minutes after eating, Leiji threw up. Then, later that afternoon, Ivo and his wife got sick too. At first, they thought it was the eggs they had for lunch, but Ivo soon realized this wasn't just a case of food poisoning. It seemed like almost everyone who had gone to the Ferreira household recently was getting sick. And by now, that included Devaier, who was feeling nauseous, as well as his mother, who had come by to visit. The list grew to include 2 of Devaier's brothers and a handful of their children. The sickness had even spread to several of the neighbors who had visited with Maria and Devaier. 2 of Devaier's scrapyard employees had also become ill, all in the span of a week. When Maria found out about the growing number of people who were getting sick, she was horrified, and she became even more afraid when she noticed something else very disturbing. There were these red lesions that were showing up on her skin that were painful to the touch. By September 27th, nearly a week after first getting sick, Maria's stomach pain was unbearable. As she lay curled up in bed listening to the rain falling outside, she thought back to that last night she felt healthy. It was the same night she had hosted the big family gathering. Maria tried to remember everything she had done that night. Then she realized something. There was only one thing that everyone who had gotten sick over the last 10 days had in common. Maria could barely move, but she knew what she had to do next. If she didn't get to the bottom of this mystery, her whole family could be in serious danger. And so, on the next morning, she willed herself out of bed and slowly managed to get dressed. Then she gathered the evidence she needed in a cloth sack. Maria knew where she wanted to take it, and it wasn't to the hospital where she'd been before. She was going somewhere that had the authority to help her. The only issue was, she needed someone to go with her. She was too exhausted to make the trip on her own. Devaier wasn't feeling well enough to go with her, so she asked another scrapyard employee to accompany her. Maria let the young man carry the bag she'd packed. She was so weak she could barely keep moving. Just down the street, they boarded a crowded bus, and about a half hour later, they got off near an office called the Vigilancia Sanitaria. This was a public health agency that regulated pharmaceuticals, food products, and sanitary conditions. It was basically the Brazilian equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Maria thought that if anybody could figure out what was making her and her family so sick, it would be someone at this agency. She and her companion entered the plain brick building through a courtyard and were taken into the office belonging to the agency's director. The young man helping Maria dropped the bag he was carrying on the official's desk. Then Maria wiped her flushed face with a handkerchief and explained what it was. She said the contents of the bag were killing her family. The official just stared at her. He looked inside the bag and seemed confused. The items inside didn't look particularly dangerous. He said what really concerned him was Maria. Maria knew she was sweating and visibly shaking, and she noticed his expression as he looked at all the lesions and burn-like marks on her arms. The official told her that right now, she just needed to see a doctor. But he did promise he would take a closer look at what was in the bag. And, just to be safe, the official put the bag on a chair in the building's courtyard, then made sure Maria knew how to get to the nearest health clinic. Maria was skeptical. The last time she'd seen a doctor, he'd given her the wrong diagnosis, but she didn't know what else to do, so she and her companion left the agency and headed to the bus stop. Maria insisted that her companion return to the scrapyard and get back to work. Unsure and scared about what she would find out, Maria boarded the bus alone. A short time later, a doctor at this clinic carefully examined Maria and then gave her a new diagnosis. He said she was right. She was not experiencing an allergic reaction or food poisoning. What she had was a tropical disease, and her family and friends who were sick probably had it too. He explained that the unusually heavy rains had been spawning mosquitoes and a host of other bugs that carried infectious diseases. A virus like dengue or Zika would explain her symptoms, including the burn-like lesions she'd developed. The doctor assured Maria that this was all very manageable and that everything would be okay. Then he arranged to have her transported to the Tropical Diseases Hospital for specialized treatment. Maria's unease lightened, and she even managed a weak smile. She finally had a real explanation for what was happening to her and her family. It was a relief to think that the bag she had left at the health agency didn't actually have anything to do with a tropical virus. Less than an hour later, Maria arrived at the Tropical Diseases Hospital. As a doctor took her vitals, she asked if he knew what type of virus was going around. But instead of answering her question, the doctor gently took her arm and began closely examining her skin lesions. Then he called one of the nurses over to look at them. The nurse said she'd seen some other patients with similar burns in the last few days. Suddenly, the doctor's face turned serious, which made Maria extremely nervous. He continued to examine her, and then he stepped back. He explained that the doctor at the previous health clinic had been wrong too. Maria's symptoms did not line up with any kind of tropical disease he'd ever treated. In fact, this doctor was afraid Maria's symptoms were connected to another sickness entirely, and if he was even partially correct, they would need to move quickly. This could be a dangerous situation. The doctor asked her detailed questions about the past several days, and Maria shared everything she could remember. She could see the alarm spread across his face the more they talked. Maria felt a terrible wave of panic and nausea start to wash over her, and then she felt like she needed to tell him about the bag. So she explained that she had brought this bag and left it at the public health agency in hopes that they would analyze it. As soon as she said this, the doctor quickly excused himself and ran as fast as he could to the phone. He called a physician at the state's Department of the Environment. He tried to hide the rising panic in his voice as he explained the urgency of the situation and that action needed to be taken immediately. Both doctors agreed that the bag Maria brought to the public health office had to be examined as soon as possible to prevent the spread of what was making everyone sick. The doctor at the Department of the Environment knew a specialist named Walter Ferreira. Dr. Ferreira, who had no relation to Maria and her family, would be able to properly analyze the bag's contents. But because it was late in the evening, they wouldn't be able to contact him until the next day. Early the next morning, Dr. Ferreira was getting dressed when his phone rang. It was the doctor from the Department of the Environment calling. Dr. Ferreira paced anxiously as he learned what was going on. There was a huge crisis taking place in Goiânia, and he needed to act quickly. He scribbled down the address to the public health office where the bag was, and then ran out the door and went to a nearby office to grab some equipment. He hoped his colleague at the Department of the Environment was wrong about everything, because if he wasn't, that meant thousands of lives were now in danger. About an hour later, Dr. Ferreira arrived at the public health office. Before he entered the courtyard, he pulled a device out of a case. The device would reveal if their terrible suspicions were correct. He carefully switched on the piece of equipment, but right away it seemed like the device was malfunctioning. And no matter how much Dr. Ferreira struggled to adjust the equipment, it just wouldn't work. The readings were just so impossible that he assumed it had to be broken. Dr. Ferreira was frustrated. Now he would need to go back to his office and swap out this broken device for a new one. So he let the receptionist know he'd be back as soon as possible. Almost 2 hours later, Dr. Ferreira returned with a replacement piece of equipment. When he turned that one on, the exact same thing happened. The readings were impossible. He tried turning it on and off several times, but he just kept getting these totally incredible readings. After a few minutes, Dr. Ferreira was horrified to realize that he had been wrong. Both of these devices had been working perfectly fine, and that meant the reality of this situation was much, much worse. If this situation didn't get handled, the whole city of Goiânia could have a catastrophic health crisis on their hands, and maybe all of Brazil could have a health crisis on their hands. So Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to get to that bag. Dr. Ferreira ran inside the building and was met by the facility's director. Ferreira asked where this bag was, but the director explained that he had become concerned about the bag's contents, so he had called in the fire brigade for assistance. In fact, the firefighters were already there and were about to take the bag from the building's courtyard. Their plan was to dispose of it in a nearby stream. Dr. Ferreira ran into the courtyard and saw a group of firefighters surrounding the bag. He yelled for them to stop, and that if they threw it in the water, it would trigger a horrific disaster. He warned them not to touch it and insisted that everyone just evacuate the building. Once Dr. Ferreira was able to explain what was happening, the firefighters realized just how serious this situation was, and they helped him clear the area. But the day was far from over. Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to track down Maria and speak to her about the contents of this bag. He located her at a hospital, but her condition had now worsened to the point where she was just too weak to even talk. But she was able to instruct Dr. Ferreira to just go to her family's junkyard, where he would find her husband, and he could answer any questions the doctor might have. It was noon by the time Dr. Ferreira and his colleague got to Maria and Devaillier's scrapyard. When they arrived, they saw Devailler working next to his garage. Dr. Ferreira introduced himself and tried to shake Devaillier's hand, but Devailler politely refused, and then he showed them the inside of his hand, and there was this huge open sore on his palm. Dr. Ferreira looked at it and then immediately shot a look of worry at his colleague. The doctor knew this type of wound on Devaillier's hand could only be caused by one thing, and it was the thing that Dr. Ferreira feared the most. Devailler told them that this whole situation began 11 days earlier on September 18th. That morning, around 10 a.m., a young man had stopped by their scrapyard and told him about some scrap metal he'd found and wanted to sell. He had never seen anything like it and thought it was valuable. Devailler said he was interested and told the young man to bring it over. Later that day, the young man returned, now hauling something in a wheelbarrow. Inside this wheelbarrow were the disassembled pieces of a large metal contraption. There was also a small capsule shaped like an oversized thermos. Devailler thought both items were made of stainless steel, which would earn him a nice profit. But after Devailler examined the capsule more closely, he became even more excited. It was lined with lead, which was an even more valuable metal. Devailler paid the man the equivalent of about $30 and brought his new purchases into his garage. He left them there before heading inside to eat dinner. Once he was done eating, he headed back to the garage to start extracting the lead. But when Devailler opened back up the garage doors, he was amazed by what he now saw inside. A strange blue glow was now coming from the thermos-shaped capsule. Devailler was a deeply spiritual man and thought he might have encountered something supernatural. He grabbed the metal capsule and called Maria into the garage so she could see it too. When Maria saw its unusual glow, she was just as mystified as Devailler. They took a closer look and saw that the blue light was coming through a small window on the side of the capsule. The window looked like it had already been punctured with a screwdriver, probably by the young man who had just sold it to De Valliere. Maria thought there could be a priceless gemstone hidden inside, but De Valliere was sure that it was actually a holy relic that would bring blessings and good fortune to the family. De Valliere was determined to continue examining this object. So he poked around the small opening with a screwdriver and removed what appeared to be several small pellets of a glittery bluish powder. The pellets were part of a slightly bigger pile that still sat deep inside the capsule. For all De Valliere knew, this luminous powder could be worth thousands of dollars. It could change their lives in a way they'd never imagined. As De Valliere told the doctors of this discovery, he remembered how special he felt handling the powder, and he wanted his whole family to experience it. This was the good luck charm they shared at their big family dinner. Over the next few days, De Valliere shared his discovery with more family and friends and neighbors, and each time someone came over, he brought out the special glitter. Small groups of people gathered around the capsule and peered through the broken window to admire the glowing powder inside. Many touched the small pellets De Valliere had extracted. Seeing how excited everyone was about the powder made De Valliere determined to extract the rest of it from the capsule. So a friend came over and, using a screwdriver, helped him remove fragments from behind the glass window. Eventually, they did get it all out. The entire pile was small enough to fit in the palm of De Valliere's hand. Once all the powder had been extracted, De Valliere gave the capsule to two of his employees and asked them to melt it down for metal and sell it to a nearby scrapyard. Then he brought some of the powder to Maria, who in turn dusted it all over her pajamas and bed sheets. De Valliere gave a grain-sized fragment to his brother, the bus driver, who rubbed it on his hands before heading into work. And on his shift as a bus driver, he came into contact with dozens of people. Another one of De Valliere's brothers dipped his finger in the blue powder and traced a cross on his abdomen for divine protection. Maria's mother handled some of the powder while she was taking care of Maria, and then she too became ill. Around that same time, De Valliere had given some fragments to his brother Ivo, and later, Ivo's daughter, Leiji, played with the glittery crystals and rubbed them all over her hands and arms. And then immediately after doing that, she had eaten her egg sandwich and become ill right away. De Valliere also shared his good luck charm with several neighbors who began having symptoms as well. After Maria had spent days wondering what might have caused so many people to get sick so quickly, she finally realized they all had one thing in common. They all had come in contact with this mysterious blue powder. So, on the morning of September 28th, 10 days after buying this capsule, Maria told De Valliere she was taking what was left of the powder and the capsule to the local health agency to be analyzed. She placed these remnants in a large cloth bag, then she headed out with one of De Valliere's employees to retrieve the parts of the capsule that had been sold to the other scrapyards. She managed to collect most of it. Those were also placed in the bag that Maria brought to the public health office. The story confirmed Dr. Ferreira's worst fears. He asked De Valliere about the young man who first sold him the capsule and where he'd gotten it. De Valliere said he wasn't sure, but he thought it might have come from some sort of abandoned facility that was located nearby. Dr. Ferreira turned to his colleague and saw that the other doctor's face had now gone white, because he knew exactly where that capsule had come from. It was a clinic that had closed 2 years earlier, a cancer treatment clinic. The capsule had come from a radiation therapy machine, and the magical blue powder that was inside wasn't from a precious gemstone. The powder was a highly radioactive material called cesium-137. When properly contained in the capsule, the powder's destructive capabilities could be used for focused cancer treatments, but without that protective shell, the powder became one of the most lethal substances on Earth. Maria and the others were not suffering from a tropical disease or any of the other things that doctors first thought. They were experiencing massive radiation poisoning, and the lesions they had developed were radiation burns. The handful of powder that De Valliere found was enough to make more than 200 people extremely ill and place thousands more in danger. Dr. Ferreira knew all this because he was a medical physicist, and the tool he had tried to use outside of the Public Health Agency was a radiation detector. He thought both detectors were broken because they were making so much noise and their readings were so high they were literally off the charts. But the detectors were correct. They were reading such high levels of radiation in the vicinity of where this bag was that contained the powder that the federal government would have to get involved. And now that Dr. Ferreira had confirmed just how serious the situation had become, he contacted Brazil's Nuclear Energy Commission. Within a matter of hours, they started testing thousands of Goiânia's residents for radiation poisoning in the city's sports stadium. On the morning of September 30th, 13 days after Devayer bought the capsule, workers in hazmat suits arrived in the courtyard of the health agency to properly dispose of the bag that contained the radioactive material. The abandoned cancer clinic, where the blue powder was first discovered, was demolished as well. On October 23rd, Maria Ferreira finally died. Her niece, Leiji, also died on the same day. They were each buried in special fiberglass, lead-lined coffins to prevent radiation from leaking out. By the end of the month, Devayer's 2 young employees also died as a result of the exposure they had received when they melted down the capsule for Devayer. While Maria's husband, Devayer, survived the tragedy, he never mentally recovered. Devayer died in 1994, 7 years later. Thankfully, no one else died from the radiation exposure, but many others sustained amputations, severe burn scars, and lifelong medical conditions. The Goiânia incident remains one of history's deadliest disasters involving medical radiation. Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Natalie Bettendorf. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our producer is Alyssa Tomaneng. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Our producer is Julie Magruder. Senior producers are Loredana Polivoda, Dave Schilling, and Matt Olmos. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louie for Wondery. June of 2011, I had just failed a very stressful and anxiety-inducing underwater test as part of Navy SEAL training, and after I failed this test, my instructor told me to get out of the pool and go over to the corner with the other failures. And so I made my way to the edge of the pool, I climbed out, and I sulked my way to the corner where I saw my other classmates who had met a similar fate on this test. They were all sitting in the corner with their backs to the pool in neat rows. And so I was totally gassed from this test. And so when I sat down, I start dramatically breathing really loud and heaving my chest up and down to show off just how hard my test had been. And about 2 seconds into this ridiculous performance of mine, one of my other classmates who had been sitting in the corner when I showed up, a big 18-year-old kid from Wisconsin named Ephraim Matos, he immediately turned around and made eye contact with me, and through gritted teeth, he just goes, "Shut up! Everybody here is in pain." And then he turned back around. And immediately, I was actually really mad at him because he just totally publicly dimed me out in front of my other classmates. But then it dawned on me, he was right. The job we were trying out for, Navy SEAL, they're not looking for people who just feel bad for themselves all the time. And so I never forgot the lesson Ephraim Matos taught me on the pool deck that day. And I, along with everybody else in the SEAL teams, never forgot the totally insane thing that Ephraim Matos did 5 years later that was picked up by virtually every major news network at the time. Back in 2012, so about a year after our exchange on the pool deck, Ephraim and I graduated and became Navy SEALs. I was assigned to an East Coast SEAL team and he was assigned to a West Coast one. And over the next 5 years, I never saw the guy until I saw him on TV. It was mid-June 2017, and I was on base in Virginia in an office full of other Navy SEALs, and we were wrapping up for the day. I was closing my email and powering down my computer, and I noticed my phone that was sitting on the table suddenly started lighting up with all these text messages from current and former teammates. And so I grabbed my phone, and all the messages said the same thing: turn on the news. And so in this office we were in, there was always a TV that was turned to the news sitting in the corner that was on mute. And so I turned to look at this TV, and on the TV from a distance, all I can see is breaking news and Middle East. And so given our profession, news like that tended to have a direct impact on our day-to-day lives. And so I assumed all these text messages must be about whatever happened in the Middle East. And so I get up, I walk over, I grab the remote, and on my walk back to my seat, I'm turning the volume up, and everybody else in the room is turning around to watch the TV as well. And we start hearing the TV reporters talking about this group of American civilians that had gone to Iraq and taken up arms against the terrorist organization ISIS. And so as they're talking about this group of American civilians, they put on the screen an image of one of these Americans. It was this big bearded guy in his mid-20s carrying an AK-47 rifle standing behind a tank somewhere in the Middle East. And as soon as I saw that picture, I knew right away why I had gotten that flurry of text messages from current and former teammates. It's because we all know this guy. The guy on TV was Ephraim Matos. 5 years earlier, after our graduation, Ephraim checked into his first SEAL team out on the West Coast, and very quickly after he showed up, they deployed to Afghanistan. During one of their missions, Ephraim was in the back of his patrol as they walked across this huge open field as they left this village they had just been in. And so Ephraim, in virtue of being in the back of the patrol, was in charge of looking behind the unit and make sure no one was coming after them. And so Ephraim periodically would turn around and he would look and make sure no one was following them. And then at some point when he turned around, he saw two little girls that couldn't have been more than 5 and 7 years old running out of the village and start running down the road towards them. Now, earlier in the day, when Ephraim and his team had been in that village, they had found a children's backpack lying in the middle of the road. And when they went up to inspect it, it turned out to be rigged with explosives. Now, no one had gotten hurt. They had defused the explosives, but they were very weary for children's backpacks. And so as Ephraim sees these two girls running up to him, he can see they're both wearing similar style backpacks to the one they found in the road. They were suicide bombers. Ephraim began screaming at these girls to stop, go back, don't come any closer, or I'll have to shoot at you. But he could tell they weren't stopping. They were just running up the road. He could see there were tears coming down their face. They were totally upset. They were obviously innocent. They were young kids. They'd been put up to this by the Taliban. But Ephraim, because he was in the rear security of his patrol, he had to deal with them like they were threats. And so at some point when they wouldn't stop, he raised his rifle up, he flipped the gun off safe, and he put his reticle right on one of the girls, and he began applying pressure to his trigger. But right as he was about to squeeze and fire a shot, the girls just abruptly stopped. It's like they knew they were about to be shot. And they turned around and they ran back towards the village. And so Ephraim put his finger off the trigger, he flipped it back on safe, he lowered his rifle, and he breathed a huge sigh of relief. But even though he didn't have to engage these poor girls, that experience totally haunted Ephraim. In fact, of all the combat he got in on that deployment, that experience with those innocent girls had the most impact on him. How could anybody force a child to be a suicide bomber? How could anyone be that cruel? And so by the time Ephraim came back to the United States after that deployment, he had changed. That experience specifically had changed him. Even though he believed in the US government's mission over in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, he felt like he could be doing more for these poor innocent people that were just trapped inside of conflict zones like these two little girls. And so over the next few years, he began looking at different conflict zones all over the world where civilians were in the most danger. And he discovered there was one place that was killing and exploiting civilians at an unprecedented rate. And that place was Iraq, where a new terrorist organization had taken power called called ISIS. So in early 2017, when Ephraim's Navy contract ran out and it was time for him to decide if he wanted to stay in the SEAL teams or get out and become a civilian, he opted to not re-enlist, so he left the military, and instead he got on social media and he contacted a foreign volunteer group in Iraq that was providing humanitarian aid to civilians. And he reached out to them and he said, "Hey, can I join you?" And of course, they said, "Yes, we'd love to have a Navy SEAL come out and support us." And so just a couple of days later, Ephraim sold his house, he packed up a bag of clothes and a backpack, he grabbed his passport, and he hopped on a plane and he flew to northern Iraq all by himself. Now, before we continue the rest of the story, you need to understand just how bold this move was by Ephraim. Now, when he was a Navy SEAL, and so a member of the United States military on active duty, when he went to Afghanistan, to a war zone, he had lots of support. If his team got pinned down by the enemy, they could call in an airstrike or they could call in backup. If Ephraim got hurt on the battlefield or his teammates got hurt on the battlefield, they could call in special medical teams that would fly in virtually any condition to come save them. And if Ephraim got captured by the enemy, you better believe America is coming for him. But in this case, Ephraim went to a war zone as a civilian. He was not in the US military, so he didn't have any of that support. If he or his team got pinned down out in Iraq, they would either have to fight their way out or get killed or captured. If he or one of his new teammates from this volunteer group got hurt, they would have to either save themselves or get killed or captured. And if Ephraim got captured as a civilian, nobody's coming for him. Nobody even knows he's been captured. He is completely on his own. But Ephraim knew these risks. In fact, he knew them better than most people because he had already deployed to a war zone and saw how important it was to have a support infrastructure. So when he flew to Iraq as a civilian, he knew he was hanging it out there, but he just didn't care. He felt like he had a mission to go help these innocent people because nobody else was. When he arrived in Iraq in March of 2017, he was met at the airport by one of the guys from this volunteer group Ephraim was going out to join. He was a very muscular, tattooed American in his mid-30s who introduced himself as Sky, and he said he had been a Marine, and while he was in the Marines, he had deployed to Iraq, so he was familiar with the area. The pair hopped in a vehicle, and Sky drove them to the volunteer group's safe house in the city, where Ephraim got a chance to meet the leader of this group. It was a tough-as-nails former Army Special Forces guy in his mid-50s named Dave. And Dave, for the past several decades, had been going out to conflict zones all over the world, and he would tell Ephraim that the worst atrocities he had seen committed against civilians in any of these places was where they were right now, in Iraq at the hands of ISIS. A few days later, Ephraim, Sky, Dave, and a few other American volunteers loaded up into this convoy made up of armored ambulances, and they left the city and they headed west into the countryside towards a huge city called Mosul that 3 years earlier had been captured by ISIS. On their journey towards the city, Ephraim and the others had to pass through a number of military checkpoints. Now, most of these checkpoints were stood up by their ally, the Iraqi army. But Ephraim and the others knew that they might stumble upon an ISIS checkpoint, and in virtue of all of them being pale-skinned Americans, they would instantly be recognized as the enemy and fired upon. So every time they slowed down for one of these checkpoints, Ephraim and the others would clutch their guns closely and mentally prepare themselves for a potential vicious close-quarters fight to the death. But luckily, they managed to go the entire distance all the way to the outskirts of Mosul without any checkpoint drama. And once they got there, they linked up with an Iraqi army unit that the leader of this volunteer group, Dave, had a relationship with. Over the first month that Ephraim was in country, he worked with this Iraqi army unit to help distribute food and provide medical care to civilians in and around Mosul. Then, in month 2 of his stay in Iraq, everything changed. Iraqi decision makers decided it was finally time to retake Mosul from ISIS. This was a huge military movement that required several units to work together and would take several weeks. The main Iraqi army was going to push inside of the city limits of Mosul and inch by inch reclaim territory from ISIS, while the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with would be responsible for reclaiming some of the villages around Mosul that ISIS had occupied. And so suddenly, Ephraim and the rest of of his volunteer group went from being humanitarian aid workers to having a direct frontline combat role with the Iraqi army. And in his first civilian combat experience, Ephraim ran across an active minefield towards this village that was occupied by ISIS. And after nearly being blown up at least 2 times, Ephraim finally made it to this village, and he began going house to house with the other volunteers, clearing them of ISIS fighters. And in one instance that he has on camera, he entered into this structure and he saw there were guns on the ground, and they looked around and they couldn't find any ISIS fighters inside, but they noticed on the ground there was a piece of plywood. They moved it aside and it revealed this huge hole that led down into the ground, and this hole connected to a huge underground tunnel system that ISIS used to escape gunfights just like this one. And so Ephraim and Dave, who was with him, just hopped right down into the tunnel. They didn't have night vision, they didn't have backup, just the 2 of them start running down this totally pitch black tunnel, periodically throwing grenades ahead of them in case there are ISIS fighters ahead of them. And at some point, after running for quite a while, just getting ready to come in contact with their adversaries, they reach this big high-ceilinged cavern that's a dead end. And they're looking around thinking, okay, I guess no one ran in here. But before they turned around and left the tunnel system, they looked up with their lights and they saw high up on the wall, dug into the wall, was another entrance to another tunnel. It looked like there needed to be a ladder to get up to this additional tunnel entrance. And so Ephraim and Dave look at each other and they're thinking, I bet ISIS fighters ran down here. There was a ladder. They climbed up and went in that entrance and then pulled the ladder up so we can't follow them. And so Ephraim and Dave couldn't do anything about it. They decide, okay, well, we'll just go out and we'll tell the Iraqi army and see what they want to do. So Ephraim and Dave, they leave this tunnel system, they go back outside, they tell the Iraqi army, and the Iraqi army brings in a bulldozer and they fill in that entrance they had found inside of the house, completely seal it up so nobody could go in or get out. And then later that night, after that village had been cleared of all ISIS fighters, they began hearing muffled explosions underground near where this entrance to this tunnel was. And what it turned out to be was ISIS fighters that realized they had been buried alive. They had snuck down there. They had used a ladder to get up into that crawl space. But when they realized they were doomed, they blew themselves up. For the next month, Ephraim and the Iraqi army unit that he and his volunteers were working with continued to periodically get into small skirmishes with ISIS in these villages outside of Mosul, but the majority of their time was spent providing humanitarian aid and medical care to civilians in the area. Then in May, their mission changed again. The other Iraqi army units that had been sent directly into Mosul a month earlier to inch by inch eradicate the area of ISIS fighters, they had done a relatively good job, but the last few ISIS fighters had been pushed up into this northern section of the city where they had bunkered down inside of these blown out concrete structures, and they were putting up an unbelievably fierce fight. So fierce, in fact, that these Iraqi army units in the city were not able to go any farther forward. They needed armored vehicles and tanks if they were going to be successful. And it just so happened the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with, that had been outside of Mosul this whole time, they were an armored unit. They had armored vehicles and tanks. And they were ordered to head right into the heart of Mosul and liberate it once and for all. And so on May 4th, Ephraim and the other volunteers loaded up in their armored vehicles, and they joined this huge line of dozens and dozens of tanks and other armored vehicles looking at the western side of Mosul. There was just a field between them and the city walls. And as soon as this massive convoy began moving forward towards the city just opened up on them. Heavy machine gun fire, rocket fire, mortars. It was just absolute chaos. ISIS knew they were coming, and so they were unleashing everything they had on them. And Ephraim would say, after his vehicle actually got inside of the city limits of Mosul and was on one of their roads, all these booby-trapped cars began detonating all around them, and the machine gun fire and rocket fire and mortar fire only intensified. At the same time this was happening, Iraqi civilians inside of Mosul saw this unbelievable wave of violence happening, and they began trying to flee the city. Now, ISIS had effectively kept them hostage inside of Mosul because they needed lots of civilians in and around the area, because it prevented Iraq and America and other forces that were fighting ISIS from indiscriminately bombing Mosul to get rid of the ISIS presence there. And so when ISIS saw these civilians running away, they began shooting them to deter other civilians from trying to escape. And so right in front of Ephraim, as he's driving into the city, men, women, children are just being gunned down all over the place. Naturally, Ephraim and the other volunteers hopped out and tried to return fire at these ISIS shooters, but they were so well fortified in different structures, they couldn't even see them, let alone hit them. So they did the next best thing. Ephraim and the others began putting themselves out in the open to draw fire on themselves so that other nearby civilians could run to safety. And for the next 3 days, that's what they did, constantly exposing themselves and dodging bullets. And then also, when they weren't doing that, they were treating these civilians that had been wounded and other Iraqi soldiers that had been wounded. Now, to this point, Ephraim had seen combat when he was in the United States Navy as a Navy SEAL, and he'd seen combat as a volunteer with this group. But it wasn't until he got inside of Mosul that he saw just how barbaric humans can be to one another. He said he saw so much death and dying all around him that it was like his brain couldn't compute that level of barbarism. He would later write a book called The City of Death, and it was about his experience in Mosul. And he said the reason he named the book The City of Death is because that's what it felt like. Everywhere around him was just death. For the next several weeks, Ephraim and the other volunteers took up a position in the south section of Mosul inside of this bombed out building. They created a sort of aid station, and there they focused all of their attention on trying to treat as many wounded civilians and wounded Iraqi soldiers as they possibly could. At the same time, the rest of the Iraqi army had pushed north and was slowly chipping away at the last few ISIS fighters. On June 1st, so roughly 1 month after Ephraim and the others have entered into the city of Mosul, they noticed a significant uptick in the number of wounded civilians that were coming to them for help. And so all day and all night, they're treating all these people that are horribly wounded with gunshot wounds and other wounds. And so at some point, Ephraim and the others begin asking these people, what happened to you? This seems unusual that so many people would show up with these wounds. And they all just seemed to be in shock. No one was able to really talk about what happened, but a few people mentioned there had been a massacre somewhere nearby. But when they pried for more information, there was a language barrier issue, and there was just the fact that they were overwhelmed with patients, and they needed to make sure their focus was on treating them, not talking to them. The following morning, though, Ephraim and the others got up and decided they wanted to push farther north into ISIS-held territory to see if there was evidence of a massacre, to try to figure out what happened to all these people that were showing up wounded. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers, they left their aid station building and they moved north about 1 block to this huge intersection, and there they tucked up against this huge concrete wall that protected them from ISIS. ISIS was down the other road that ran through the intersection. They were holed up in this huge bombed out hospital that overlooked this intersection. And so from where they were, ISIS couldn't see them and they couldn't shoot them. At some point, Ephraim poked his head around this wall, looking down the road towards this burned out hospital, and what he saw along the road shocked him. There were dozens and dozens of civilians that had been killed laying all over the place. It would turn out the day before, a huge group of civilians had attempted to flee the city, and they ran in front of that burned out hospital where ISIS was, and they gunned them down. And they killed over 200 civilians, men, women, children. They didn't care, and they wounded at least 100 others. And so that was why there was that huge uptick in wounded civilians the day before. And so as Ephraim is scanning this carnage, being careful not to stay exposed for too long, he notices one particularly large pile of bodies. There's about 20 or 30 bodies. He sees in this pile, there's clearly movement. And he can see there is a little girl who's attempting to hide herself under her dead mother's clothing. And then next to this girl were 2 other adult men that clearly were wounded, but were alive. Ephraim immediately starts yelling to them to run to him, you're gonna get killed out there. But the 3 of them were completely shell-shocked. For the past 24 hours, they had been laying inside of this pile of bodies. And so they were not going to be able to move on their own. And so Ephraim realized unless they did something to get them out of there, they were going to die. So Ephraim and the others ran back to their Iraqi army counterparts, and they got them to sign off on a rescue mission. And their plan was they would have one of the Iraqi tanks drive down that road straight towards that hospital where all the ISIS fighters were, and right behind the tank would be an Iraqi Humvee, inside of which would be Ephraim and the other volunteers. volunteers. And so they would go straight down the road. The tank would serve as a sort of shield for the Humvee. And after the tank passed the pile of dead bodies, the Humvee would be lined up right next to it. Ephraim and the others would hop out. They'd grab the girl and the two other men, pull them back in the Humvees, and then the two vehicles would back up to safety. Once this plan was in place, Ephraim and Dave and the other volunteers contacted the American military in the area, and they got them to authorize a smoke screen. They would fire artillery shells with airburst smoke grenades that would obscure the view of the ISIS fighters in the hospital. They wouldn't actually be able to see the tank or the Humvee or this rescue operation taking place right in front of them. And so shortly after these plans are totally finalized and Ephraim and the others are loading up in the Humvee and they're getting in position to turn that corner and begin this operation, the driver of the Humvee says, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. It's not safe. I'm not willing to do it. Ephraim and the other volunteers tried to convince him to still do the operation because they didn't have time to get a replacement Humvee, and they had already coordinated with the American artillery units that were going to be firing these shells at a certain time, and so they really didn't have an opportunity to do this operation again if this guy backed out. Not to mention, if they didn't get out there quickly, these three people were going to die anyways. And so finally, when Ephraim realized this driver was not going to budge, he was not going to go in this operation, Ephraim and the others got out of the Humvee and they walked up to the tank driver and they asked him, are you still prepared to go on this rescue operation? And he said he was. And so even though if they went through with this mission, it would mean Ephraim and the others would be on foot behind the tank, completely exposed, they were still totally down for doing it. In fact, Ephraim would say at no point did they consider canceling the mission. They were so focused on saving these three people that they were prepared to sacrifice themselves to do it. And so the tank driver closed his hatch. Ephraim and the others got behind the tank. They turned that corner so they're facing the hospital. And then a couple minutes later, as planned, American artillery launched these airburst smoke grenades that totally obscured ISIS's view. And as soon as those smoke clouds were in the air, ISIS came out and just started firing randomly straight down in the general direction of where this tank was. They couldn't really see the tank. They had no way of knowing what they were doing out there. They just knew something was going on. And so meanwhile, Ephraim and the others are tucked up behind this tank as it's slow rolling in, as rounds are impacting all around them, mortars start landing all around them, and it turns out there were other ISIS fighters, not just directly ahead of them in the hospital, but also off to their side in other buildings. So they were getting hit from two directions. Ephraim remembers as he was behind this tank trying to stay as small as he could, he began dry heaving because he was so terrified. He was completely convinced he was going to die that day. Eventually, the tank made its way just past this pile of bodies, and at that point, Ephraim actually stepped out and fired back towards ISIS in the hospital and over towards the berm to provide some cover fire, while Dave and another volunteer ran over and pulled the girl and the other two men out of the pile and behind the tank. The girl and one of the men were okay. They were not badly physically hurt, but the other man was badly hurt and he couldn't walk. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim and his team found a piece of sheet metal on the ground behind this tank, and they rolled him onto it and used it like a stretcher and began dragging him as the tank began moving in reverse. And so as bullets are still flying all around them, rockets are landing next to them, they're moving, they're making good progress, when the wounded man slips off of the sled and he lands right in the tracks of where this tank is going to go. And for a variety of reasons, Ephraim and the others had no way of communicating with the tank driver. So the tank driver is just going to keep on moving and he's going to run over this injured man who can't go anywhere. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim leaps down, he grabs the injured guy, and he rolls with him out of the way of the tracks right as it goes past him. But now Ephraim and this wounded man are outside the protection of the tank, and rounds start impacting all around them. The smoke screen at this point is pretty much cleared, and so ISIS sees them. And Ephraim at this point makes a heartbreaking decision. He looks at this guy who he knows cannot move himself. He's badly wounded. He makes eye contact with him. He holds his hand, and Ephraim just shakes his head and says, "I'm sorry," because he knew he couldn't move him fast enough behind the tank before both of them got shot, and he couldn't throw him on his back in time before both of them got shot. And so he had to leave him. And so Ephraim jumped up, he leapt behind the tank right as a volley of fire hit right where he had been standing, and then Ephraim and the others continued moving back. That wounded man would go on to be killed by ISIS. Only a few moments after Ephraim was back behind the relative safety of the tank, he suddenly fell to the ground and felt a pain in his right leg. He
he had been shot through the leg. But where he fell was right in line with where one of these tank treads were coming. But again, they can't talk to this tank, so they can't stop the tank from running him over. And so a surge of adrenaline came over Ephraim, and he leapt up onto his feet and just continued hobbling behind the tank despite this gaping hole in his leg. Eventually, they made it all the way back to that intersection where they had started, but the only way they could get back down the alleyway to safety with the Iraqi army was to run across a small segment of this street. Basically, you needed to be exposed for just a second running across. But at this point, the smoke screen was gone. ISIS knew exactly where they were, and they were waiting for them to pop out from behind that tank. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers are screaming across this gap in the road towards the Iraqi army to get them to send an armored vehicle across this road, pick us up, and bring us back across. We can't run across this gap without getting shot. But because of the chaos and the noise, the tank is firing, there's mortars, there's rockets, there's gunfire, it's crazy.